Well, good evening and welcome to another in our series for International Development Studies lectures here at the University of Montana. Tonight I'm delighted to introduce my friend Steve Siebert, who's a professor in the College of Forestry and Conservation, and he actually has his PhD from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, my alma mater. And although he focused on forest science, one of his minors was in Southeast Asia studies, and that's one of my minors
Exactly.
too.
We didn't
So
overlap, but pretty close.
it's a miracle. He's the director of International Conservation and Development MS program here at the University of Montana, and he has numerous publications. I just wanted to note that he has published work on many, many different parts of the world, most recently Bhutan, but also Indonesia, Belize, Greece, Costa Rica, and Malaysia. He's an expert on the production of rattan, which we use to make wicker or baskets. And then he has one of many papers, but the favorite title that I read was, quote, "Where There Is No Beer." And so, anybody who can, write about beer and the lack of beer is number one in my book. So Steve has agreed to let us interrupt him with questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and he can answer it, even, in the middle of his discussion. So thank you to Professor Siebert.
And let me just repeat, I really do want to have questions and comments as I'm going along. And I realize you're passing up the opportunity to hear another Clinton-Trump debate, so don't make me do all the talking. What I'm going to do tonight is basically kind of summarize work that I've been doing for most of my career since being a graduate student at Cornell and subsequently in places that I've worked around the world, and that is looking at the relationship of biological diversity and ecological processes more broadly and historic land uses. And so what I'm going to do today is, and I'm going to give you my summary point, so if I lose you in the process, you can hopefully find what I'm talking about, or if you fall asleep, you'll at least know what the major themes are. The first point I'm going to make is that biological diversity, I'm using that as a very general term to encompass not only the species in an ecosystem, but their structure, the types of vegetation and their height, ecological functions, and ecological resilience, is influenced by a lot of different factors. But one of those is the historic disturbances that have operated in a place. That is, maybe trees getting blown over by wind or dying from insects and disease. The second point I want to make is that humans, in my opinion, are part of nature. Now you might think, well, that's self-evident, but a large proportion of biologists, and in particular conservation biologists in the conservation field, frequently don't consider humans really to be part of nature. And a good example of that is our own national park system, Yellowstone Glacier. Humans can visit, but they can't farm, they can't collect, they can't hunt, they can't do any extractive activities. The third point I'm going to make is, coming out of these two first ones, is that historic land uses, the way that people have lived on the land in various places, has functioned as an ecological disturbance. Well, that's pretty self-evident. But more interesting is the fact that many of these historic land uses were not only compatible with biological diversity, but in some places actually created and maintained biodiversity. And they did that through something that I'll get into in a little bit more detail using ecological jargon. It's called increasing landscape heterogeneity, which just means the diversity of patches and plants across a landscape. The fourth point I'm going to make is that these historic land uses, livelihoods that have operated in some places for tens of thousands of years, have over the past century, and in particular the past couple of decades, changed or ceased entirely. Rapid change throughout the world. And that's going to have some social, economic, and biological effects. And finally, what I want to spend a little time doing towards the end of the talk is, well, what might an understanding of biological diversity and the role that humans have played in certain places, how might that inform future conservation and development activities? Any questions? Pretty clear? All right, so let me begin with just a real quick overview of biological diversity crisis. Probably all of you in your entire cognizant existence have heard and been just confronted by biodiversity loss, whether it's Save the Whales or Save Panda Bears. The loss of biological diversity has been front and center in global concern for decades. And this just summarized from some latest IUCN figures on the number of different species by these taxa that are either threatened or endangered. Now, in addition to this loss or threat of biological diversity, another tremendously significant extinction is occurring, and that's with cultural diversity. And in fact, cultural diversity losses are far more severe than biodiversity losses. One way to capture this is to look at languages. Languages are not just a collection of words or grammar, but as the ethnobotanist, anthropologist Wade Davis argues, they're a reflection of an understanding of a particular place. They convey knowledge about the region of the world and the relationship that those people had with that particular place. So around the year 2000, there were thought to be something on the order of about 6,000 languages around the world. However, only 10% of those were stable. That is, there were a significant number of people who were using the language and young people learning the language, that it was likely to survive. 90%, in other words, threatened and endangered. If you break this down a little bit more specifically, New Guinea, one of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet, tremendous floristic and faunal diversity. Also an incredibly diverse place culturally. Roughly a third of the world's languages in 2000 were spoken on the island of New Guinea. But 500 of those languages are spoken by less than 500 people. In other words, they're disappearing. Maybe to look at the United States, in 2000 there were about 175 indigenous languages. Salish, Blackfeet, Crow, what have you here in Montana. But 55 of those, a third of them, were spoken by less than 10 people. Old people. They're dying out. They're disappearing. So what I'm suggesting here is, in addition to this tremendous loss of biological diversity, there's even a more severe and pronounced loss of cultural diversity. And one of the points I'm going to make is that these two are related, and that the loss of cultural diversity may result in the loss or have impacts on biological diversity. Any questions? Comments?
So 0 kids in California can speak the
Yes.
indigenous languages?
0 kids. Nobody of, and by the way, California, if you're looking at it in terms of biological diversity, was one of those incredibly diverse spots in North America. Really high biological floristic diversity, plant diversity in particular. Also cultural diversity. But those languages are basically, probably within a decade or so, will be gone unless something radical happens and people, young people learn those languages to convey that tradition on. So what's happening here? Well, what explains this tremendous loss of biological and cultural diversity around the world? Well, one of the major forces, beginning the colonial era, but continuing through the post-independence era, and particularly in the last couple of decades, has been the conversion of forests and historic livelihoods and land uses to other activities. This image captures it pretty well. I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. Before this picture was taken, a couple of years before this, in peninsular Malaysia, this was a lowland rainforest, Dipterocarp rainforest, one of the most species-rich places on the planet, right up there with the Amazonian rainforest. The area was logged, it was then bulldozed, burned, and it's now being planted to oil palm. A very, very lucrative crop, production of edible oils, but also some cosmetics. And this is occurring on an unbelievably large scale throughout Southeast Asia, literally millions and millions of acres. Throughout much of the 90s and early 2000s, an area about the size of Connecticut was cleared annually on the island of Borneo in Indonesia alone. To give you some sense of the extent of this conversion and the rate at which it happened, publication from Bradshaw in the late 2009 era documents through remote sensing the loss of forest cover through different parts of Southeast Asia. If you look at the top left, mainland Southeast Asia, in just 2 decades, the majority of Southeast Asian forests had been still in some native forest cover, were liquidated. Thailand literally lost almost all of its primary forest, converted to a variety of intensive agricultural purposes. Still some areas in particularly Cambodia and Myanmar in the top left that were in native forest, but these have been rapidly converted as well. I spent a year and a half doing my dissertation work in Sumatra in the top right, and forest cover in the 80s when I was there was pretty similar to 1960, some loss, but within the last couple of decades, you can see just literally total conversion, total loss. Conversion in this case largely to oil palm plantation. Similar situation in Borneo and New Guinea. So one of the causes of this tremendous loss of biological diversity and cultural diversity was literally the conversion of forests and livelihoods. But a second influential factor has been certain types of conservation and protected area management. And in particular, the adoption throughout much of the world of an American model of protected areas, like Yellowstone National Park, where people are separate from nature. You can visit Yellowstone, but you can't hunt there. You can't graze cattle. You can't farm. And what you're looking at here is a wildlife sanctuary. It's now a national park in the country of Belize. And this was established, as you can gather from the sign here, to conserve jaguars. And one of the first things that was done when this park, wildlife sanctuary in the national park, was established was to evict the resident Mayan population that had been living there for generations. In the background, you see a few thatch huts. They were moved out of the park and are now living outside on the boundary of the park. All of the historic uses that the Mayans might have made in that area, milpa, shifting cultivation, hunting and gathering and so forth, prohibited. That's had a huge impact, obviously, on those people, but I'm going to make a relationship to those activities that people played in terms of managing the land and using the resources for biological diversity as well. So let's move to that. What are the explanations for biological diversity around the planet? What are the causes or sources? Well, if you start at the really large scale and long time period, there are continental or geologic explanations. So, for example, North and South America were separated for millions of years. They developed a very different flora and fauna. Australia, isolated for millions of years, a marsupial mammal population. Think about isolated islands, the Galapagos or the Hawaiian Islands. Very high levels of endemism, that is, species that are found only in that place and nowhere else. So history, isolation, time of isolation, the capacity to migrate across ocean barriers, those are all factors that influence biological diversity at a large scale. At a more regional scale, there are factors like climate, topography, mountains, and again, isolation. One way to perhaps think about this is if you've traveled from the Pacific coast of Washington or Oregon, the lowland temperate rainforests, cedar, Douglas fir forests, up over the subalpine fir, mountains of the Cascades, to the eastern side, ponderosa pine, and then you enter the high Great Basin desert. Tremendous variability caused by climate, rain shadow effects, the influence of mountains. Moving downscale further, there's a lot of local level factors that can influence biological diversity at a particular place. Soils, the kind of soils that develop from the underlying geology. The aspect And here I mean in the northern hemisphere, like Missoula, what direction does the slope face? If you look outside, well, we can't, it's dark, there's no windows. But you look out on the slopes of around Missoula, you may notice that south-facing slopes are largely bare, they're grass. Those are drought-prone, very sunny. On the north-facing slopes, more shade, more moisture. You have vegetation like larch or Douglas fir growing up. And another aspect of that local influences are disturbances. The disturbances that have affected vegetation over time and animals over time. And this can be both natural disturbances, like fire or wind or insects and disease, but also, I'm going to argue very strongly, human uses, human disturbances. And in particular, how over time, cultures adapted to, used, and managed their environments, in some places for tens of thousands of years. And one way to think about this, and you'll see this if you get into this subject in the literature, is they're sometimes referred to as linked social ecological systems. That is, wherever you go around the world, most environments are a reflection of both ecological conditions, the soils, the climate, but also the social conditions, the way people used and managed that environment for thousands of years. All right, so I want to talk a little bit now about disturbance. I've used that term a couple of times, and what I provide here is an ecological definition for disturbance. It's some event that changes an ecosystem or a community or a population or maybe soils. And one of the points about this kind of ecological definition is that there's no negative connotation. And when we use disturbance in familiar language, that's something bad, right? You know, you don't want to be disturbed because you were sleeping, or you know, you got a headache from whatever it was that disturbed you. Ecologically, a disturbance should be thought of as a normal, inevitable, natural process. In fact, it's one of the factors that drives evolution. So it's a very basic, fundamental ecological phenomena. And there's a very interesting relationship between disturbance and biological diversity. A classic paper written, about 40 years ago by Connell argued that biological diversity is greatest at intermediate levels of disturbance. And he based this looking at tropical rainforests, incredibly diverse environment, and coral reefs, two very, very different systems. And what he argued, if you think about it for a second, what he's suggesting is that in the absence of disturbance, think about a forest. A nice, beautiful, well-developed, tall forest, big trees, a lot of shade, you have the understory vegetation. But it's a closed forest. There's no gaps. No light is getting down to the forest floor. Well, that's a very rich forest, but certain plants, certain animals that utilize those plants won't be able to live there. If they need high light environments, grasses, flowers, forbs, they're not going to survive. And animals that require that, deer and elk, may be lower in numbers or absent entirely. Similarly, at the other extreme, if there's a lot of disturbance, frequent disturbance, you don't have a well-developed forest. You have mostly open grasslands or flowers or whatever it is, meadows. Well, you're going to have plenty of organisms that like that environment, but you won't have those that need a forest to survive in. In our part of the world, that would be forest-dependent animals like martins or fishers or other interior bird species that require well-developed forests. So what Connell argued, and based on the evidence, was that at that intermediate level, every environment, every forest, every biome a bit different, but where there's intermediate levels of disturbance, you have both. There's gaps for the sun-requiring species, the shade-intolerant, as well as environments for plants and animals that require shade. And the same argument for coral reefs. All right, now I've been talking generally here, and what I want to do now is turn to a particular case, a particular spot, and see how this plays out. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about is the country of Bhutan. I've had the good fortune of working in Bhutan for the past 9 or 10 years. Bhutan is a small kingdom in the eastern Himalayas. It's about the size of Indiana or Switzerland. It's biologically a very diverse place. Explanations for that run the gamut of continental to local. At the continental scale, it's a convergence of Indian, Eurasian, with influences of Southeast Asia coming together. Climatically, tremendous diversity due to the impact of monsoonal rains, that impact the country in different ways. And topography, extreme. You know, this is an area the size of Indiana, ranges from several hundred feet in the south to 25,000 feet within about 100 miles. So tremendous diversity biologically. It's also a place that's very diverse culturally. A lot of unique ethno-linguistic groups, people that speak unique languages. But one of the things that these ethnic groups in Bhutan did over the centuries with it, they developed ways of using and managing the land to survive and to thrive. And the three most important and widespread uses, historic land uses, was shifting cultivation. That is the cultivation of a field for a relatively short period of time, 1 to several years, then allowing that field to rest or return to forest vegetation for a longer period of time. Sometimes that's managed. And then moving the field to another site. So you're producing food crops, but moving around the landscape. It's not fixed permanent fields like we think of farms. Another very widespread land use in Bhutan for thousands of years has been livestock grazing, cattle and yak. This fellow in the top right is a yak herder. We're probably at about 15,000 feet. He but herds his animals across the landscape in a very regulated way, moving them from pasture to pasture, making cheese, which is what's drying in the background. And he spends the summer living in that black tent made of yak fur, which is rather ingenious because when it rains, that hair, the yak hair expands, it becomes waterproof. It's also black, obviously, and this is a cold environment, so even a little bit of sun heats that tent up, makes it actually pretty warm, a little solar energy. The other widespread use of forest and alpine environments in Bhutan has been for non-timber forest products, like mushrooms or rattan, what this woman has on her back. She's collected this rattan not for binding or basketry, but as a vegetable, a heart of palm, kind of like asparagus. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is that all of these uses have occurred throughout Bhutan for centuries, and they haven't occurred in a random way. You can't just go out and establish a farm. You can't just take your animals and say, oh, okay, I'm going to go graze up on this mountain slope. No. Uses were regulated and managed so that as you, say, became of age, maybe starting a family, a husband and wife would be given permission by elders to establish a swidden farm in a particular location. They would know how to do it, having learned from their parents. Similarly, they have to follow very specific guidelines on how to move livestock around pastures throughout the course of the year. All right, so if we think about ecological disturbances in the context of Bhutan, this is in the northwestern part of Bhutan, obviously a high elevation site. Some of the most common disturbances naturally in Bhutan are landslides and erosion. If you think about it for a second, the Himalayas, which is what we're talking about here, are actually still growing. They're being formed by the movement of the Indian shield northward that's slamming into the Eurasian shield, resulting in the uplift of the Himalayas. You combine that incredibly steep topography with monsoonal rains, which come every year off of the Indian Ocean, and you're going to get landslides and erosion. Obviously a big disturbance. Not so much here because we're at high elevation, but if you go into middle and lower elevations, of course there's going to be trees all the way down into subtropical rainforests in the south, and trees die. They die from insects, disease, wind blows them over. These are all natural disturbances. But in addition to these natural disturbances, there are the human disturbances, the anthropogenic disturbance that I mentioned, the swidden farming, grazing, and forest product collecting. So how do we make sense of these kinds of disturbances? How do we try to understand their impacts or their effects on biological diversity? Well, one way to do that is to go back to the ecological literature and to say, well, let's try to look at the specific characteristics of each of these disturbances, their attributes. So the type, the size, how big it is, the intensity of the disturbance. Maybe one way to think about that would be a fire. Is it a really hot fire that burns everything, or just a fire that passes quickly through and only burns some of the grasses or forbs underneath the trees? How long does the disturbance last, its duration? What's the frequency or the return interval of that disturbance? If you think about it in the context of Montana, I don't know how many of you spend time in the forest, but our lodgepole pine forests throughout western Montana are fire-dependent ecosystems. They need fire to reproduce. And those ecosystems historically burned, depending on the elevation, the aspect, at an interval of 100 to 250 years. That's what I'm talking about in terms of the frequency. What kind of landscape pattern is created by a disturbance? If you've had the luck to go to Yellowstone, or if you get a chance to do it, look out over the landscape, because what you'll see is a pattern, a very interesting landscape pattern that reflects the fires of 1988. Very widespread forest fires throughout the park in '88, but they left a mosaic. Some areas burned really hot, limited vegetation. Other areas didn't burn at all, and everything in between. And then finally, what are the cumulative effects of not only those disturbances, but other disturbances happening on top of them over time? That's where it gets really complicated. But this is a way to maybe think about anthropogenic as well as natural disturbances. So one of the things I've worked on in Bhutan is to say, well, how do these disturbances compare with one another? The natural disturbances like tree death or mass wasting, landslides and erosion, with human disturbances like swidden. And I'm not going to go through all of this because I'll get too deep into the weeds, but let me just point out a couple of things. If you look at our framework of disturbance attributes, size, intensity, duration, and so on, and compare natural tree deaths, natural mass wasting or landslides with swidden, that shifting cultivation. In terms of size, intensity, and duration, that swidden disturbance is intermediate in size between a tree fall and a large erosion event. In terms of intensity, intermediate between a relatively low intensity of a tree falling over or dying from insects or disease versus a landslide, which might remove not only the vegetation, but actually the soil down to bedrock, and its duration. So the argument I'm making here is that in the case of these human land uses, these historic land uses in Bhutan, they've been intermediate in comparison to natural disturbances. All right, so I've talked about Bhutan, and you might say, well, God, that's pretty interesting, but can you generalize from that? And the answer is yes. What's rather interesting is over the last decade, maybe 15 years, there's just been an explosion in evidence about the role and importance of historic land uses in shaping biological diversity. The plants and animals that are presently observed in a site being influenced by previous human activity. One way to appreciate this is with this image here. As Teresa mentioned, we spent some time working in Bhutan and ran a field course to Bhutan throughout much of the 90s. And one of the places we spent a little bit of time was in western Belize, at this site, which is Xanantanich. And this is a small Mayan ruin. You're looking west out over western Belize into the Petén of northern Guatemala. And it's a forested landscape. But 1,000 years ago, archaeological evidence suggests that the population of this area was probably about 10 times what it is at present. During the classic Maya era, Tikal, Coracal, Palenque, all of these Mayan centers were city-states, huge city-states, that obviously had to support their populations through agriculture and other means. Now, I bring this up because archaeologists are using Landsat imagery, mapping of vegetation through remote sensing, to identify sites of particular interest for them to subsequently explore archaeologically through actually digging. And the rationale for that is the forest still shows signs 1,000 years later of the Mayan presence. In particular, what it shows is trees that were important to the Maya are more abundant in and around areas of high population. So trees like Rimon or Cahoon palm trees can be actually identified through remote sensing vegetation. Where they're more abundant, they tend to show the presence of the Maya in the past. So that's 1,000 years after that particular disturbance. Same kind of situation in Amazonia. One of the most species-rich areas on the planet. About 15% of the Amazon basin includes soils that have black earth, charcoal incorporated into the soil. And you say, well, where does the charcoal come from? From previous fires. Well, yes, previous fires, but it was deliberately incorporated into the soil by Amerindian Indians. So this is prior to Spanish or Portuguese contact. Large portions of the Amazon basin were cultivated and managed very differently than we think of farming, but they did it through incorporating charcoal to maintain the fertility and productivity of that soil over a long period of time. Same story in West Africa. Classic paper by Fairhead and Leach some 20 years ago, documenting the effect of previous human use on current vegetation. Same story throughout Southeast Asia. Australia, another really interesting example of relationships between historic land uses and biological diversity. Australia has been inhabited for about 50,000 years. That first wave of people moving out of Africa moved across South Asia, Southeast Asia. Remnant populations can still be found, New Guinea, remnant populations of Aborigines in Malaysia, Indonesia. But Australia was where the Aboriginal populations basically ended up. And they ended up modifying their environment in some significant ways. They did so through the use of fire. They used fire to create and manage conditions which were favorable to them. And one of the things that's very interesting is that women were the primary land managers. They were the ones who were utilizing fire. And specifically what they sought to do was to increase landscape heterogeneity. Now I'm using that term again. They specifically burned to create patches, a lot of diverse patches, open areas, and then areas of vegetation. Why did they do that? Because one of the critical food sources were marsupials, small mammals. And that created ideal conditions for those small mammal populations. So over 50,000 years, they managed that landscape utilizing fire. Now it's rather interesting, these recent publications document that in some detail. One of the things that's rather interesting is with the changes occurring in Aboriginal land rights and land use, those burning practices have stopped. One of the things that's now being observed is a decline in those marsupial populations. They don't have the habitat anymore. Another place to see this is the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, second only to the lowland tropics in terms of species diversity of plants, incredibly diverse. A lot of shade intolerant, meaning the plants need sun. You think about all of our spices, basil, thyme, oregano, sage, all of those have dozens or hundreds of wild counterparts in the Mediterranean, but they need sun. Now, if you think about the Mediterranean in another way, you'd say, well, there's probably not a place on the planet that has a more intense history of human use and management. Successive waves of empire, from the early Minoans in the case of Crete, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Babylonians, Arabs, it goes on and on and on. Tremendous diversity of cultures utilizing and managing this landscape, but somehow maintaining this rich biological diversity. What you're looking at here is kind of a typical Cretan view, or Cretan landscape view, and it's a landscape of mixed uses. The kind of grayish green are olive groves. You could see some terraces in the lower areas. There are chestnut trees. You move up into higher slopes. Those are used for extensive livestock grazing, kind of like in Bhutan, but using sheep and goats rather than cattle or yak, but in a managed way for thousands and thousands of years. Closer to home, here in Montana and throughout much of North America, Indians used and managed our lands with fire. The Salish, in particular, right here in and around the Missoula Valley, used and managed the forest environment for probably 10 to 12,000 years. And they did that by setting frequent low intensity fires. What they were doing in these low elevation ponderosa pine and larch forests was to try to create conditions that were conducive to their livelihoods. By frequent low intensity burning, they were able to produce grass and forage for deer and elk that they hunted, and later for their horses when they acquired those from the Spanish. Those frequent burns also were conducive to sunlight reaching the forest floor and providing optimal conditions for plants that they needed for food, bitterroot, medicinal plants. They did it for defensive purposes. This area of Missoula into the Hellgate was called a Hellgate because this was a no man's zone between the Salish and the Blackfeet. They fought over it. By clearing out the understory, you could actually see through it. You were less likely to be ambushed. So a whole lot of reasons and examples of how Salish, just in our own area, used fire to manage the land. If you're interested, that publication I mentioned by White, it's an interactive DVD prepared by the educational arm of the Salish. Jermaine White is the educational coordinator. It's in the library. If you got time, take a look at it. It's beautifully done. It combined traditional ecological knowledge and practice of the Salish with modern scientific knowledge, and paired photographs of what has transpired up on the Flathead Reservation after 100, 150 years of no burning. Very interesting, rich. All right, so let me summarize a few things here. Historic land uses, I'm arguing, functioned as ecological disturbances, like in this Swidden landscape in Bhutan. At least in some places, these practices created and maintained biological diversity. And they did that by increasing landscape variability or heterogeneity. And I'm not going to go into it, but there's also a strong argument to be made that these practices increased ecological resilience. If you think about it for a second, the Salish lived here for 10 or 12,000 years, since the Pleistocene. During that period of time, there were significant differences from the present in terms of temperature and precipitation, periods of drought, periods relatively cold. the way that the Salish managed those lands were conducive for their survival and the survival of the plants and animals, suggesting high resilience. And these systems were obviously linked socially and ecologically. All right, now let me delve into a little bit more now about, well, what's transpired here. I mentioned that over the past century, but in particular the last couple of decades, forests have been converted, historic livelihoods and land uses have changed or ceased. Well, what's happened? Well, we might refer to our contemporary era as the era of corporate globalization, beginning in the colonial era, but accelerating after the end of the Second World War, in particular in the last couple of decades. We've seen a globally pervasive form of economic development imprint itself on people and land. And it's one characterized by a market or export-oriented production. You produce crops for export or export wood products or what have you. There's an emphasis on privatization. That is, individual households owning land or corporations, in contrast to many historic or indigenous societies that manage land communally, collectively over very large areas. The emphasis in contemporary agricultural production or economic development in general is to maximize profits, maximize yields. In the agricultural arena, that's achieved through inputs, the inputs of petrochemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides to increase crop yields. There's a focus on permanent fields. You know, we're not shifting around here. We've got permanent farms. And there's a focus also on single crops. You maximize banana production on a plantation, utilizing optimal input of resources to get that high yield. Switching back to Bhutan, until 25 years ago, Bhutan was largely a subsistence economy. That is, households, whether in high alpine environments or middle elevation forests or lowland areas, didn't have access to roads. They pretty much had to rely on whatever they could produce agriculturally through the growing of crops, rice at lower elevation, wheat, barley, corn as you move to higher elevation, livestock, a diversity of crops, literally hundreds of indigenous varieties of crops and crops cultivars. Some sold or bartered in exchange. But over the last couple of decades, that's transitioned really dramatically. That historic land use, those traditional farming practices of a diversity of subsistence food crops, has given way to the cultivation of potatoes for export. They export these potatoes to India. With the income, they do very well. They make a lot of money. They no longer even grow rice or wheat or barley or corn. They buy imported, polished basmati rice from India. It's very cheap. Now, that can introduce a whole other discussion of health and nutrition. But ecologically, it's going to have obviously a huge impact. Instead of a diversity of crops and this complex mosaic of land use, permanent fields, potato cultivation with external inputs.
And no barley, no beer.
And no barley, no beer, exactly. And now they import Indian beer. And maybe as an aside, you know, where there is no beer, it was a paper I wrote where I was living in Indonesia at the time. And most every place I lived, people found some way to make an alcoholic beverage. And in this particular place, they were making it from a palm. And it was really good, a Renge palm. So it was a palm wine, kind of palm beer. But anyway, that's an aside. We can talk about that if you're interested. Now, in addition, another thing that's occurring, going back to that theme about widespread forest conversion, economic development, the other thing that's happened throughout much of the world has been protected areas established, conservation, or the widespread simply decline of agriculture. In Crete, You're looking at an image here. You can see the ruins of an old hamlet. 100 years ago, this was all in a variety of different agricultural production. Some open fields, some chestnut groves, terraced fields, some fields grazed intensively, some olive groves. But what's happened throughout the Mediterranean for 100, 150 years has been outmigration. You know, think about it, the huge wave of immigrants to the United States, they came from places like Italy, southern Italy. They came from Greece. You know, Missoula has a Greek population. They're immigrants. They left the land. They migrated. The same thing happening in Montana. The average age of a farmer or rancher household in Montana is now upper 50s or lower 60s. By some estimates, the population of eastern and central Montana, if you take out the cities, you know, get rid of Helena, get rid of Billings, it's less now than at any time since before the Indians came in the Pleistocene. People are leaving the land. Same thing's happening all over the place. Now this is changing, obviously, historic disturbance regimes. You know, there's no longer the grazing. There's no longer the collection of forest products or farming. But what kind of disturbance do you think might happen in a place like this? You know, here we are in Crete. If you don't have, you know, think of Southern California. You don't have disturbances, vegetation grows up, more and more plants, more and more biomass accumulating. What do you think might happen?
Potential for fires?
Potential for fires, absolutely. Mediterranean, just like California, this is a chaparral environment, or to put it another way, ecologic, it's a Mediterranean ecosystem, which means chaparral. Wet winters, dry summers. Well, in the absence of disturbance, vegetation is going to accumulate more and more fuel. You know, you go from Crete south, the next landmass you hit is North Africa. That's the Sahara. You know, that makes the Santa Ana winds of Southern California seem like a cool breeze. Incredible fires, total different disturbances. It's going to change forest cover, it's going to change landscape heterogeneity. And what it's doing, interestingly enough, in a place like Greece and Italy and Spain and this Mediterranean environment, it's resulting in a loss of biological diversity. Why? Because in this heavily shaded environment, all of those understory plants that used to be found, all the sages and marjorams and basils and all those native, incredible diversity of our spices, but their wild relatives, can't grow. They need sun. They don't grow in dense shade. So that's disappearing. And the same phenomenon is happening all over the world. Not everywhere, but it's widespread throughout North and South America, widespread in Europe, it's happening in Bhutan. All right, so what I'd like to end with, and then we can have maybe some questions and discussion, is, well, okay, I've created a story about biological diversity, its relationship to cultural diversity. Well, how might that inform conservation and development in the future? What are the implications in particular? Let's go back to the example of Bhutan. Bhutan is a country, as I mentioned, it's about the size of Indiana. Its population is roughly 1 million, a little bit less, roughly about the size of Montana population-wise. The primary source of energy for cooking and for heating is wood fuel. Now that's changing because the country is embarking on a rapid effort to develop hydroelectric energy, primarily for export to India, but also to provide electricity for domestic consumption. But you've got a country that's heavily forested, and they're committed to their native forests. The Bhutanese constitution actually mandates that at least 60% of the country will be forever in native forest cover. Wow, incredible commitment. Well, they're doing really well because 15 years ago, that had increased to about 70% forest cover. And a remote sensing GIS Landsat assessment done 3 years ago now has that figure at about 81%. So the forest cover is increasing a lot. People are moving off the land, especially young people. These historic livelihoods, extensive livestock grazing, Swidden, they're no longer happening, particularly among young people. Who wants to be a yak herder? I mean, you got to spend 5 months wandering around at high elevation in the cold rain. Jesus, by yourself, how miserable would that? I'd rather get a job in the city, you know? There's clubs, there's bars, there's things to do. That's what young people want to do. They don't want to be a yak herder. So you can't go back. I mean, it's totally unrealistic to think, well, we'll just go back to herding yak, or we'll go back to being Swidden farmers. That's unrealistic. The changes that have occurred politically, economically, agrarian transformations, that makes it impossible. But what about all this wood energy? What about all this wood sitting around there? Well, one of the opportunities might be to utilize that wood in a way that mimics historic Swidden disturbances. So if you think about the point I made earlier that those shifting cultivation practices in Bhutan were intermediate between the natural tree falls and the landslides, perhaps mimicking those disturbances could maintain some of the ecological advantages that they provided. So how would you do that? Well, you'd do it at intermediate scale. So you'd perhaps harvest areas in 1 to 2 hectare size. You'd cut the trees, obviously you're removing the wood, and maybe take the slash, the tops and branches, and spread them out and burn them on the ground. Maybe do it on a frequency of 10 to 20 year rotation, and do it to create a mosaic, this nice patchy landscape pattern. Now this would be advantageous for a number of reasons. Wood is obviously a renewable source of energy. It can provide income, jobs. It's also a very localized, decentralized form of energy. You could produce the energy where you need it in and around communities, or even larger areas, some of the smaller cities. And it avoids the social, economic, and environmental costs associated with building large dams and the transmission lines required to send that electricity all over the country. Now, if you think, well, how realistic is that? I had the good fortune of spending the better part of a year in Switzerland a couple of years ago on a faculty exchange. And Switzerland, Austria, southern Germany, and the Dolomite region of the Alps are very interesting because of the preponderance of local wood biomass energy generation. And what you're looking at here is the town hall in the village of Au. It's a small village in western Austria. It's an alpine community, a steep mountain valley surrounded by high peaks, actually more of an air quality inversion challenge than Missoula has, a forest that's somewhat similar to ours, a lot of spruce, a lot of fir, but nowhere near as much forest cover, much more densely populated. And in addition to the town hall, what you're seeing here is underneath that town hall, a state-of-the-art wood energy biomass facility. All of the energy required to heat this town center, about a dozen homes right around this municipal hall, and 4 hotels, all of that energy is produced in a state-of-the-art facility that's below, underground beneath this town hall. And you don't see it. And in fact, it's going full blast right now. This is winter. So that's the level of emissions that you're looking at. We're talking about very high temperature, complete combustion, catalytic converters, and other ways of removing residues, removing particulates. And in addition to all of those benefits, there's an underground parking garage that all of the community uses that's heated by just indirect heat left from this biomass facility. And it's not just Au. These are all over the place. There are literally hundreds of these. Every single village almost throughout the Alps has a local wood energy biomass facility. They vary in size. Some of them produce only heat. Some of them produce heat and cogenerate electricity. The one you're looking at in the lower right is in the Dolomites in La Villa. This is one of the premier ski areas of the Alps. It's a place where tourists and residents are not going to tolerate any kind of pollution or inversion problems because tourism is so valuable. This is one block off of Main Street, and this biomass facility provides the same kind of benefits as it does in Au. Heat for dozens and dozens of homes and hotels in this village. Now I bring this up because we have the same kind of opportunity in Missoula. Right now, the Forest Service in the Lolo district has embarked on a project called the Marshall Woods Project to do a number of restoration treatments in the main Rattlesnake Corridor, as well as up the Marshall and Woods drainages to the east. And if you get a chance, go up there. I mean, ride your bicycle or get somebody with a car to take you up there. This view right here I took a couple of weeks ago. It's about a mile up from the trailhead. And what they've done, I don't have a picture beforehand, but this was a dense, the large trees were present, but there was a dense understory of pines and firs. Historically, that wouldn't have been like that because the Salish burned it. They had those frequent low-intensity burns that would have eliminated that. They burned because they wanted to have good hunting and to produce balsam root and bitterroot and other things that were important to for food and medicinal plants and so forth. But what I want to call your attention to are these piles. There are literally thousands of piles up there. Hundreds of thousands of tons of biomass. Now, we don't have any outlet for it. It's simply going to sit there, and then next winter, next January, probably starting in November, but through the winter months, a year from now, it'll be burned. We're just going to burn it up. Now, there are going to be some implications from that. Obviously, you couldn't pick a more dirty way to burn it than in the winter at low temperature. So all of this is just going to go up in the atmosphere. We don't get any energy from it. So I just want to pose that as a possible alternative for our energy needs that might combine with replicating some of the historic environmental conditions that existed here for thousands of years. So to kind of summarize, and then let's go into some questions and discussions. I mean, I've obviously made the point. Biodiversity is influenced by historic disturbance regimes. Humans are part of nature. Many of these historic land uses created and maintained biological diversity through creating more intermediate scale disturbances and creating a very diverse mosaic across the landscape. But these historic land uses have changed or ceased. So if we want to have the ecological benefits, the species diversity effects associated with those disturbances that they operated in the past, we might have to think of other ways of doing it. But we'll have to do it in ways that make social and economic sense. I mean, what's going on in Marshall Woods is perhaps beneficial from an ecological point of view, but it's very expensive. We're paying a lot of money, a lot of tax-paying dollars are going into cutting, piling, and burning that biomass. We're not using it. If we were to use it, we could reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and have more revenue to do additional treatments elsewhere. And that's my argument for perhaps trying to build on social and ecological legacies as we move forward and think about conservation and development. So that's all I'm going to say. And please, nobody asked a question. So now you have to ask a question or make a comment or something. Yeah, please.
Recently there was in Oregon, they were saying that there was elk disease, and the elk disease, is what you're saying it's got to be regarding to the mass bioconsumption, because if the elk disease is going from mountain.
Okay.
I mean, if the land is breaking up, that's what's gonna happen. I mean, it's like, I'm gonna have to say, like, okay, all of the bunkers, we can't deal with them. Did you find anything with like, the elks, I mean, the goats, in other parts of the world that are experiencing these diseases?
I don't know anything about specific, diseases of livestock, no. I mean, they could be out there. I don't know. Yeah,
Could
Teresa.
you say a few words about the proposed, maybe it's defunct now, biomass plants here on campus?
Yeah.
Which seems like it might have been close enough to benefit from some of the cutting in the marshal.
Yeah, there was an initiative, 4 or 5 years ago, on the campus to convert our fossil fuel biomass facility to wood biomass. And I worked on it, as did a lot of other people. And the objective was to try to have a facility that would utilize low-quality, small diameter thinning material like they're taking out in that picture I showed of the rattlesnake in Marshall Woods, and chip it and then burn it for heat and electricity, primarily heat on this campus. There was a lot of opposition to that for a number of reasons. I mean, people were concerned about air quality, which is a justifiable concern. I would say that over 95% of the air quality issues we have in Montana in Missoula are related to cars. That facility was going to be very similar to those that are operating in the Alps. They're not totally particulate or emissions free, but they're remarkably so. They're really quite good, and one could make the case, if there's bad inversions, to not burn during those periods of time. Ultimately, the whole initiative failed, or just was dropped, in part because of opposition, but more importantly because as this was proceeding and we're making economic projections, there was a technological change called fracking. And fracking and directional drilling, horizontal drilling, all of a sudden reduced the price of natural gas to such an extent that there was no way you could justify economically cutting and hauling wood or investing in a wood biomass facility. So, we benefit from low natural gas prices, but there's a trade-off. We weren't able to switch off of a fossil fuel to a renewable resource or deal with some of the residues that were being produced for management purposes. And maybe just to relate this back to the Alps, I toured a number of these village-based biomass facilities, and they were all very much locally based. They're small. They were a bit smaller than what was being proposed on this campus, but maybe half to 2/3 of the size. But they were all getting their material within about a 6 to 10 mile radius. And that's in an area where they don't have as many forest resources, and where, despite that amount of cutting, they still had a problem with too much forest regrowth. And you think about it, well, why is that bad? Well, in the case of Switzerland, where we were living, when you think of Switzerland, what do you think of? You think of like alpine meadows and Heidi and chocolate. You don't think of a dense forest, right? Well, despite all of the cutting to try to keep the meadows, the alpine meadows and the dairy cows and so on, the habitat in place, forest encroachment is pretty widespread throughout Switzerland, despite that level of cutting. So we've got we have the resources here. The question is, how do we use them?
Could such a generator here burn the pine beetle killed pines?
Sure. Yeah, it could burn. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but if you go to East Missoula over by Bonner, that old mill used to be a Champion mill. Then it was Stimson from Oregon, but that was sold out, and now they're just using it as a log dumping ground and shipping site, and that's put on trains, railroad cars, and shipped out to Central Washington. Which is, I mean, they're not doing this to lose money. It's an income earner for them. But it sort of suggests that, gosh, if we had the ability to, maybe make an investment over the longer term, we could utilize some of those resources right here and displace fossil fuels. Yeah.
So you had given the suggestion that we should build on the historic and social, ecological legacy, so to speak, by creating those kinds of forest, like wood burning generators. And I'm just curious if you actually have proposed that for the Missoula area, or like what is actually in effect in terms of making those kinds of changes.
Yeah. Okay, repeat. The question is, have I maybe explored some of the opportunities to restore these social and ecological legacies here in Missoula or elsewhere? And the answer is yes. I mean, in the context of Bhutan, we shared our work with the Forest Department, who are now actually concerned about increasing fire problems and increasing insects and disease outbreaks, similar to what we've experienced in Montana over the last several decades. Closer to home, I've been working with a bunch of private landowners in the upper Rattlesnake where I live, to get everybody on board to take advantage of some cost-sharing funds from the NRDC through the Department of Natural Resource Conservation of the state of Montana to allow landowners to do some thinning and restoration work. We own about 6 acres, and over the course of 15 years, I removed a lot of the understory trees, kind of like you saw in that rattlesnake photograph, and then hired Mark Vandermeer, Watershed Consulting, a group here in Missoula, great outfit. They do some really good work. Got a bunch of student volunteers, and a year ago in March, burned the whole hillside for probably the first time in 120 years since the Salish did it. And that's the kind of thing I think we'll see perhaps more of by other landowners, as well as the Forest Service. So I think there's some options to do that. The trick, though, or the challenge, is that I'm just taking the wood and piling it and burning it. And I guess I stay in shape by doing that, but I'm not making any money, and it's costly for the government to try to subsidize that. So it'd be nice to find some outlet for that low-quality wood to help it fund itself. Yeah.
If cultural land use practices have been out of practice for long enough, I guess in the case of Bhutan, this maybe hasn't been long enough, but in Montana it's certainly been a long time.
Yeah.
What's the risk, or how would you classify the risk of invasives taking over once those practices are put back into use?
Great question. The question was, historic land uses have ceased or no longer operated in many cases for a long time. And what are the risks of invasive species coming back in following a disturbance if you were, say, like in the rattlesnake, opening it up? A major problem. If you spend any time in the rattlesnake, you'll probably realize there is knapweed everywhere. And so if you open up that understory, it's going to be conducive to balsam root and lupin, the native flowers, but it's also going to be very attractive for knapweed and hawkweed and leafy spurge and everything else. So in my own case, on the 6 acres I own, I've worked hard over the years to literally hand spray, or now over the last few years it's under control enough to hand weed the knapweed. Leafy spurge, a little more problematic because you just can't get rid of it. I mean, it's deep rooted, it's persistent, so I actually contract with somebody to spray it. Spray it at a time when it's not likely to impact the native vegetation later in the year. But it's a great question, and it's going to be along with habitat loss or changes, invasive species are right up there in terms of global threat to biological diversity everywhere around the world. Yes?
I have one question. Recent consumption model is very different from the traditional or historical model. For example, in Japan, we depend on almost all trees on the importing logging from the Southern Asian country or Canada or Russia, and sometimes it causes problem like too much logging in Southern Asian. So I think it is a problem in that is not existent in all time. So do you think we should constitute a self-sufficient model?
Boy, that's a great question. So the question is, should we think about changing our consumption model with the example of Japan, which has been a major player in timber harvesting in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, Southeast Asia entirely, yeah. And I guess two things. One is that if you look at forest cover in Japan, it's rather interesting. Following the Second World War, there were major forest efforts to reforest Japan. So Japan is actually very heavily forested now. They have a large proportion of marketable timber, particularly up in the northern island of Hokkaido. But the challenge for Japan is labor costs are really high. You know, it doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense to pay top dollar to harvest your own timber if you can get it really cheap from Malaysia or Indonesia. So yeah, there's going to have to be some kind of a way of accounting for those costs, for those other impacts, social and ecological. You know, I'm not sure I'm optimistic for a completely new world consumption pattern, except for perhaps that, as many have advocated, and maybe we'll move toward it at some point, a carbon tax. And that would be a way of reflecting at least some of the social and environmental costs associated with using fossil fuels. That wouldn't get to the issue of Japan cutting its own trees versus importing them, except indirectly, because then it would include the cost of transporting all of that timber from Southeast Asia up to Japan or elsewhere, because it's a fossil fuel dependent transport system. But that's a good question. That's a challenging one.
Have you been working with the government of Bhutan on their laws regarding forests or reforestation or, removing swidden, etc.?
Yeah, we've worked with certain sectors of the forestry department and their the counterpart to their national park system. One of the things that is very interesting about Bhutan is that unlike much of the world, when they began establishing national parks, they did not adopt an American model. That is, people were allowed to stay in national parks, and some historic uses, land uses were allowed, which is rather important because over half of the country of Bhutan is in a national park or protected area now. You know, it's unbelievable. But despite that policy, that government policy, they did make the decision a number of decades ago to prohibit swidden. They allow livestock grazing, they allow forest product collecting and the collection of medicinal plants and so forth. But they banned Swidden farming nationwide. And they did that because they were influenced by the dominant global argument that that form of agriculture is destructive. Now, in recent years, that has softened somewhat because Bhutan, the government of Bhutan, Nepal, India, and other countries in the Himalaya signed an accord a number of years ago that recognized that Swidden was a well-adapted agricultural system that was compatible with plants and animals, and this is perhaps the most interesting, appears to be more sustainable and more productive than any of the alternatives that have been proposed for the high Himalayas, the eastern high Himalayas. So from Nepal going eastward across northern India, Bhutan into Myanmar, which is rather striking. Now that hasn't reflected itself all the way into government policies. Swidden is still being discouraged. But an even bigger problem is what I kind of alluded to, and that's cultural change. There aren't young people who want to be Swidden farmers anymore, or yak herders. So that kind of cultural change and market change and just the changing social economic system is going to make going back to Swidden, virtually impossible. Yeah.
They use the drone to prepare the palm plantation. I've seen people start to thinking, well, they can maybe buy a whole bunch of land that's already palmed, and then start using the drones to start to replace those trees. What do you think about technology?
To do exactly what with the palms? So you have an oil palm plantation?
Drones that actually like it, and they start planting trees, and they're able to measure, use the drone technology to measure out what that land needs to be able to put it back together.
I mean, that kind of drone technology is incredibly powerful. I guess it would be very useful to maybe the question was, what are the options to use drone technology in maybe restoring degraded palm plantation lands? I mean, certainly you could use that as drones and other remote sensing technologies to monitor vegetation change, soil changes in soil conditions and so forth. But whether any of that happens or not is really more of a political, social and economic decision. That right now the value, the amount of money that can be made from oil plantations is just so high that it's a real strong economic driving force, and governments derive a significant amount of foreign exchange earnings. It's a powerful driving force for forest conversion. So it's hard to see how that's going to change without some pretty significant changes in the way we calculate social and economic costs and ecological impacts.
Thank you. This is so fascinating. Can we give him a round of applause?